What do you think, man? It's awful early. You ready to light this sucker up?
Just say good morning and go for it.
Fair enough.
Whatever.
Man, there's some brave souls in this room. It's 8:30 in the morning. Who all went to that little shindig last night and ended up hurting themselves a little bit? Yeah, a couple of hands. Anybody George Carlin fan? So George Carlin had this one skit that he did that like perfectly describes my head this morning. He's talking about cats and how cats are like super cocky and self-confident and they don't have a need for anywhere else. And he says, he's talking about this cat's running around crazy around the house. Zip, 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 bam! Runs headlong into this sliding glass window. Pops right up, looks around, I meant to do that. I meant to do that. 10 minutes later, cat's behind the couch in a wheelchair. Effing meow, effing meow. Anyway, that's a bit of how I tend to feel at these 8:30 sessions. Somehow I always get sucked into doing these early sessions. So this, it was interesting as I threw down this abstract for this session, because I've done a few different sessions on NetScalers over the last 4 or 5 years or so, and I thought I'd done some pretty cool stuff with NetScalers. I think I built my first production system on a NetScaler back in like 2006. So I was pretty proud of myself. I had some cool stuff to share, got some good feedback from people and stuff. But then a very interesting thing happened. I met someone who was way, way, way on top of their NetScaler chat. And you know what happened next? I got schooled. I got totally schooled. So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce a BriForum virgin to his very first session presenting at a BriForum. Fortunately, not his first time presenting, period. Otherwise, he'd be kind of shot this morning. But please give a nice BriForum warm early morning welcome to Mr. Henrik Johansson.
Cheers and morning.
So you saw the session abstract here. I had a good time getting a little bit wordy with it. But it's kind of funny. There's so many NetScalers out there. How many of you have NetScaler in around the implementations that you're doing? Yeah, so how many of you would say that you feel like you're actually getting some good solid value out of that stuff? You're like milking them, leveraging a few features out of them? Yeah, you can't say anything.
I like that half of them raised their hand and shook their head at the same time.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. So it's kind of funny. That's something really, really common. Citrix is pushing these darn things pretty hardcore. And I got to admit, even as an ICA SSL proxy, they're pretty darn cool, and they do their job and some of the authentication options. And so, over the years, I'd mentioned I'd thrown down quite a bit and done what I thought was some pretty cool stuff. But as soon as I met this character right here, and we started talking a little bit more about it, I learned that there's a bloody heck of a lot more that you can do with it, number one. And number two, that it's not as inaccessible as you might think. So how many would you consider yourselves more application engineers? You guys who work with Zen App, Zen Desktop, VDI. All right, then how many would you consider yourselves like network types?
We can do.
Yeah, local, you don't count. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how many people end up kind of getting drug into this networking thing. But I'm kind of interested. You've been around, Henrik, you've been around this marketplace for quite a bit. How did you end up getting sucked into this networking bit?
Well, the thing is, I've been working with Citrix product like 12 years or something, and like you did. I worked with Zen-Up, I worked with MetaFrame, I worked with WinFrame and stuff like that. But then I found a cool thing. Not saying that the other things aren't cool. You're really cool in here. But then...
Are we too low?
Are we too low?
Is your other mic lit? Be that one.
No. That might explain something. Are we good now? Oh, there we go.
Much better now.
So basically, I discovered the Access Gateway and the NetScaler. And before that, how many of you have played around with Secure Gateway? How many of you still have Secure Gateway running somewhere? Yeah, I thought so. So basically, I come from a sysadmin background. I've done some networking, like most of you have. I've played around with, like, started with the HP blade switches, and when they came out as called themselves a network product before they actually use networking in a way that networking should be used. Come from a security background. That's the sound you were looking for.
It was the feedback. I knew it was coming somewhere.
So I've done my fair share of penetration testing, of database management. One question we forgot to ask, how many of you work with database admin and not just pure DBAs, but a couple of them. So I've basically played around with most of the Citrix products. Like I said, I've been working with it for 12 years. It's hard to avoid it. But the thing that really got my eye is the NetScaler, and especially when I started figuring out all the things you can do with it. And like most of you, I mean, I use it for ICANN proxy as well, but it's when you go beyond that that the really cool stuff works, actually. And I know some of you in here have played a lot with it. I know you have Thorsten in the background as well that will tell you a lot about scaling as well. So,
for sure. So tell me something cool you've done with it. What's like the kind of sickest? If someone asks you, hey, what kind of rockin' stuff can I do with this?
I was going to say setting up dating sites is kind of cool, but that's for a different reason. I don't need that. But, well, I mean, you can do a lot of things. I really like, for example, playing around with moving the user around automatically. We set up this one solution, for example, which is basically a fully automated provisioning system that takes a user who want to log on with no credentials whatsoever in the system, with only a smart card, who enters the smart card, gets moved around between different provisioning systems. During that time, that user is created in the Active Directory, is provisioned with all the permissions they want to use based on a central database, depending on what type of stamp he has. If he is a doctor, for example, moved around, auto-provisioned, automatically logged on to Zenap through the Access Gateway portal in the last step, and he can launch this application from having no account whatsoever, just by using a smart card. The user has no clue what the password is. Everything is full transparent for the user. So that account is going to live for one day until he decides to pull it out, and then the account is dead. Then the next time he comes in, the auto-provisioning goes through again, and the NetScaler is sort of moving the traffic and moving the user around by checking, for example, different cookie headers or whatever. So,
is that healthcare?
That is definitely healthcare.
Yeah, I was going to say, that sounds an awful lot like healthcare. So most of the time, people get into and do the basics, right? Set up an AG basic mode, set up authentication, pass through to a web interface site, fire up some STAs, and maybe if they're going a little bit further, they get into and actually do crazy things like load balancing web interface servers. Are there XML services?
I mean, those are the basic things. Definitely that the first thing you definitely want to do when you set up Access Gateway system is load balance all the internal resources. I mean, you have the load balancer there. Even if you buy the standard version, you have everything there you need to provide a really redundant solution for everyone. So definitely load balance all your resources. I mean, your web interface is obvious, but I mean, load balance your LDAP servers, your Radius servers, not SAs, but I mean the XML servers, whatever you want to do, just bounce everything to NetScaler. Just make sure you place it in the right place in the network, so you don't put it out there in the DM set and keep getting a lot of firewall hits all the time. So it's all about
crazy,
placement.
but I've actually load balanced STAs. Not
You could
on the
do that.
NetScaler side, though, on the web interface side. Right?
You can do it, so
STA
yeah.
web interface.
You can do it as well. I mean, just make sure how you set up the load balancing. And it's also, I mean, I think we had a discussion yesterday or the day before about, for example, load balancing, data collectors and brokers and stuff like that. And there's a lot of discussion going on today. For example, what servers you're going to use as brokers? Are you going to use the data collector? Are you going to use every server? I mean, with the NetScaler, it's really easy to set up, for example, that you have your two preferred servers as the primary ones. I mean, if they by any chance would happen to fail, just set up a background service that's going to kick in once those go down. So I mean, you can actually set up all the servers you have as load balance, but you're not going to use the other ones unless you're really in deep shit. So
that the technical term?
That's the technical term. It's in a white paper.
Nice. So what you'd mentioned in the first conversation that we had that in some of the work that you used to do, back when you were on the other side of the pond. Recent immigrant, by the way, to North America. We dragged him over. He's now in the San Jose area. But you mentioned that in the work that you used to do, you actually ended up, in a lot of cases, coming in after people had done the basic NetScaler setup, and then you took it to the next level. What?
A lot of stuff we do is, besides, for example, we're going to go through a couple of things later on as well, like securing the NetScaler, securing the resources, making sure that you're not going to get hacked, for example. But also, for example, if you're running a multi-tenant solution with different customers, it can be different internal customers, it can be different external customers, different areas within the same company. That you want to, for example, use different GUIs for the web interface. How many of you brand the logon page on the web interface?
At least some basics, right? Footer, header, maybe slash.
Changing the logo. And it's fairly easy to do. You can fairly easily just edit the code, for example. The thing is, if you have, for example, 5, 2, 10, whatever, different customers or different people, they're going to see different logos. How do you do that? Do you, for example, set up 10 different access gateway solutions or 10 different access gateway portals? Or, you can do everything, basically one single portal. That's, I would say, is one of the most common, setting up like multiple access point, but just using one access gateway. I actually got a really quick demo, or example what I'm talking about.
So what you're saying is that one of the first things that we want to talk about is leveraging NetScaler to do some multi-tenant-ish stuff.
Exactly.
Right?
If I can. Hey, looky.
So what you got here?
This is basically just a regular access gateway. As you can see, that's also one of the things. Automatic redirection, for example, just really basic stuff. Automatic redirection to HTTPS. If you don't do it. It's one of the simplest things you can do. As you can see here, resolution is really fun when you're working on the dual screen.
And trying to work around the side. I thought we were going to be able to get away with dual screen mode. So when you're filling out the session, whatever, things at the end, one of the things that we need to put on there is that floor mount monitors actually make it quite a bit easier for people to do demonstrations and stuff versus looking sideways.
Exactly. As you can see here, it's just a single access gateway. The setup. So when I hit the HTTP, it automatically redirects to HTTPS. Nothing strange here, just the normal interface, but if I, for example, go to another URL, we get another company logo. This is just a really simple modification. We just replace the logo directly on the fly in the code. The thing is, I can basically set this up as many companies as want to. I can't even see if that's right. If I go to the second company, still using the exact same. This is also the same way I can use, for example, sessions. Remodeling. If I, for example, set up different session policies, I can do the same way here. So this is just a fairly easy example that if you want, for example, oops. It's much easier when you see the screen.
So is this multiple access gateway VIPs, or is this a single VIP?
You can also get the RIC site.
Sweet. Yeah, my own site, baby. Right on.
As I said, this is just a fairly example of how you can do screen modification, but you can also do session modification. So, for example, by looking at different host headers, I basically adapt the GUI on it, but I can also use these in expressions and say that if you're hitting the execute with 2 sites, we want you to hit the VPN site or the VPN configuration. If you're accessing the execute with 1 site, we're going to hit the ICA proxy. But everything is running in the same site, just use expressions to differentiate them.
So expressions. Talk a little bit more about what you mean for expressions.
Expression is basically NetScaler's way of looking at different situations. For example, in this case, I look at a host header saying that if the host header is containing AG1, then I'm going to use these type of policies. The way I do this is basically by leveraging something called SNI. How many of you are using SNI?
How many of you know what SNI stands for?
So SNI stands for Subject Name Identifier, which is basically a way to use multiple certifications on the same site. And the way you select the appropriate certificate is by looking at the host header. This feature has been in NetScaler for quite some time. No one, as you obviously can see, is using it, and there's a big reason for that. It's not supported by XP. Exactly.
Yeah, no kidding.
Exactly. Which is also no, exactly. Which is also why I wanted to use show it, because exactly as Johansson said. I mean, it is a really cool feature. It will help out a lot by using different certificates on the server. Even if you want to use wildcard, if you're in a multi-tenant solution, you might want to use different root certificates or different whole certificate names. So instead of using site.com, you might want to use site2.com. The problem with wildcard is that you can't do that in the same way. With SNI, everything would be cool, but I've had a lot of customers who actually hit problems because they were using SNI and weren't aware that XP does not support it, and it's not a browser-based problem, it's an operating-based problem. So just so you know, it's a cool feature, but don't use it.
So where's that leave you then? Can't use that. What's your solution?
The only solution is, I would say, definitely use wildcard certificates. If you can use them, you do that. You're going to run into some discussion with security people probably that's going to claim that they're not secure enough. That's not true. We can take that discussion anytime. They usually have the opinion that it's not secure because you can use it for as many sites as you want to, and yeah, exactly, that's the purpose of it. So use wildcard if you can. If you need different names on it, you have to use different sites on it, unfortunately.
So I'm kind of interested. I know that we got a guy here that is called a chief security officer for a company around. I'm wondering what, Kurt, what do you think? Do you start hammering on wildcard certs, or you make a case for or against them?
We definitely make a case for it. They're very worthwhile, save a lot of money, make everything very flexible and easy to use, but yeah, you definitely have to understand the limitations, and if you do have to support older operating systems and things that are going to make it break, either redirect them somewhere else where you don't have it used, or just don't use it in the first place.
Thanks, Kurt. Kurt Romer, Citrix Chief Security Officer.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that wildcard will, however, solve a lot of problems, especially once you start getting into hosting web apps and web systems, because it's going to grow out really fast. As soon as you hit the first website out there, I mean, you're going to grow to maybe 10, 20, and just keeping up with management on 20 different certificates and renewal of those is, the cost of one wildcard is definitely eaten up by that. So
what are you using in the background? You showed SNI and gave us a good example of what not to use and why. What else are you using on the NetScaler, like configuration-wise?
One of the most common ones also is adaptive authentication and chaining different authentication methods, which also can be used really good with with a wildcard search. So you can, for example, set up that you have one site that's using SMS as an OTP token to get the two-factor authentication. Quick question, how many of you are using two-factor authentication?
All right,
Fair
so
amount.
imagine that you're staring to the eyes of someone who's a desktop or application systems engineer, and you just said that, and their eyes glazed over. What does it mean to someone who's not a network geek?
I mean, two-factor authentication basically is saying that, not two-factor, but
No,
the way of using
the other bit, the chaining of
the chaining of authentication is basically that you can set up multiple authentication sources. So you can say that I want to use LDAP for all my logons, but for this site, I want to use SMS or, someone showed passcode yesterday. I want to use passcode. On this site, I want to use smart card, for example. On another site, you might want to use just LDAP. And chaining authentication methods is a way that you, for example, look at the host header and say, okay, if you're using that host header, this authentication method is not going to be used. One thing you need to think about if you're using smart card is that even if you are chaining them, users who happen to have a smart card or a certificate on their laptop when they hit that site is going to get a question every time they go there. Do you want to use this certificate? Even if they're not going to log on with that one, they're still going to get the question. So you can chain smart card and certificate logons in the same site as, for example, LDAP and passcode, but I would definitely recommend that you put them on separate unless your users are going to not appreciate it. It doesn't enhance the user experience.
So when you're talking about chaining, you're talking about defining multiple auth policies, right?
Exactly.
And the different priorities between them.
Different priorities and also different, expressions, checking out when to use a certain authentication method. You can even go through them all and just let them fail one at a time until he finds one that works, but most of the times I would say use expressions to only run the ones you really want to run, otherwise you're going to get a lot of false positives in the logs.
So the logs are the main thing. Is there any performance hit if you chain them and let them fail?
I mean, it's basically the same time as doing a faulty logon. So it's a performance issue, but mostly it's just annoying.
All right, so possible solution then it sounds like for, I've used chaining and primary and secondary authentication policies for things like two-factor on iPad. And that's worked out pretty good. But it sounds like this would probably also be a good way to handle multiple domains.
Exactly, and for example, a lot of people out here using radius, just using different radius sources. All OTP systems like passcode don't have a token device as well, so might have to use them in case the user doesn't have, for example, mobile access if they're done in a cable or whatever. So they can use different types of radio sources as well. So, and definitely I want to push like smart card logons and stuff like that. It is working and it's a really safe way of logging on. The only issue is that you do require smart card read on all the clients you're going to use it on. So,
sure. And
if you hit any problems, just use there's a really good way of troubleshooting logon issues on a NetScaler. Yes, there's a file called aad.debug. Google it and you're going to find how to see everything that's regarding logon.
So smart cards in the U.S. are pretty popular in like the U.S. federal government. Anybody from the federal government? Cat cards? Friend or foe?
I like them.
You like them?
Yep.
How much of a pain in the patella were they to get set up all the way through?
I haven't set up yet.
There you go.
You're not going to like them afterwards.
Yeah, they definitely introduce a few complexities. But the usability actually can be really cool.
I would say most of it's really usable and you can use them, for example, we're going to talk a little bit later on as well, using them for accessing websites and securing access to different websites. They are really good to have. It's a pain in the ass to set up sometimes, but most of the configuration you actually do on the back end in the Active Directory and setting up SPNs there. So you don't do that much issues with the NetScaler by itself. And again, it's fairly easy troubleshooting it.
So recognizing that the demo monkeys are what they are and that they very well may jump on your back.
Oh yeah.
Can you show us a couple of I'm a very visual learner, so when I see something, it sticks a lot more. Can you show us a little bit more about how you set that VIP up to do what you just did there? VIP. So VIP, is that a foreign TLA for anybody? Sorry, I'm making the assumption that an AG VIP, that an AG VIP is common knowledge. Access gateway VIP, virtual IP.
So this is a fairly easy expression. Like I said, I mean, this site only have one authentication source since not using anything else on it. This is a fairly easy expression, basically checking that if the requested HTTP header, and we're looking for the host header, which contains the server name you actually entered into the browser. If the server name you entered is AG1, then we are going to use this authentication profile. You can actually set up multiple chains here. You can also add secondary authentication. If you're doing, for example, iPads and you want only, or any other source where you want just a single point of, or a single authentication engine, you just set up the same LDAP in the second one, because if you enter something in there, you are required to get approved by that one. Another good thing to know is that when you enter multiple sources, you get 2 logon fields in the on the logon page. If you want to, you can actually disable the second logon field because it's going to use the same password as you entered in the first one. If you leave that one out empty, it's going to take the same password and push it to the second authentication source as well. So you don't have to show both fields. You can just set it out in the code.
So the expression stuff, that almost looks like a development language. And I know I've used it, but when I've used it, it's more like, well, to a certain extent, here's the white paper, go through and set up this expression, and I didn't have the faintest clue really what I was doing.
It's fairly easy. I would say that this is also the standard version. They have advanced expression as well, which makes you can actually do a lot more. You can, for example, access the new analysis feature in the NetScaler, so you can say that, okay, I want to set up an expression that looks on the website that is using, that has the most hits on for the last 10 minutes. So you can adapt the rules as you go, basically. You actually have a lot of help here as well. If you want to, you can use the GUI to sort of find out most of the stuff. For example, if you want to work on the request side, basically incoming, or if you want to work on the responder side, which is outgoing request. And then, I mean, if you feel unsafe, uncertain, just use the GUI for it. It's not that hard.
So are expressions, I mean, it seems to me like expressions, because you can use them in so many different places. Those are kind of like a gateway to unlocking some of these additional features. Would you agree? Or?
Yeah. If you never use expressions for the version in, for example, if you just set up NSTrue, which basically just let this hit everything, start learning expression, because you are going to use it in everything you do, basically, in all the policy rules and all the rewrite rules, or whatever you're going to use. So start learning expressions. It's a good thing. And when you get comfortable with that, start with regex. It's really fun, actually. So
really fun.
Yeah.
So basically, you're pretty sadistic. Yeah, leave it at that. So
exactly.
Are you also at the back end? Are you directing users to different sites and stuff? I guess in this case, maybe not.
In this case, we don't. One thing to keep in mind as well when you're talking about the backend solution is that if you're using load balance, or rather if you go directly to an LDAP source, the NetScaler is going to use the NSIP to access the authentication engines. So it's actually going to use the NetScaler's own unique IP. If you're using a load balance system, it's going to use the subnet IP when it accesses the backend systems. So this especially is when you set up radius sources, because you need to enter the agent in the radius server. So if you ever had any issues with, for example, you end up setting up 3 radius agents, if you're doing load balance, you only need the subnet IP.
So I know one of the things that when I'm discussing a system and a design for a customer that I talk about, and one of the reasons I like the NetScaler is because you can do authentication at the perimeter. So a user never touches an internal resource without actually authenticating first. I know we had talked a little bit about some of the ways that you can actually use the NetScalers to handle authentication to other kinds of sites.
Exactly. there's a feature called AAA that basically enables you to set up authentication for any published resource through the NetScaler, I would say web resource though. So no matter if you're using SSL or HTTP, I mean, you will use SSL. You can set up a front-end GUI, which is basically a logon screen. That's going to, when the user enters, for example, www.whatever.com, they will first see the NetScaler logon box or the logon screen. It's almost the same as the access gateway, but uses a slightly different GUI. In that logon screen, you can actually set up the exact same logon fields as with the access gateway. So if you want to use two-factor authentication, just hit it up there. Your backend doesn't have to support two-factor in any way. You can set up smart card or LDAP or whatever you want to use there. And as soon as that user is logged on, they're going to push back the credentials back at the backend server. One thing to keep in mind there is that different backends work in different way, of course. So if you have a website in the backend that's using form-based logon, you might want to create a single sign-on rule for that. So the NetScaler is actually going to fill out the login information automatically for you and log you on to the backend website. You can also use 401 authentication, which is just going to push up logon box that the user fills out, username and password. That is, on the other hand, better for example, Outlook or native apps that actually speak 401, because then if they are trusting the source, they can log on automatically. So
401, what is that?
Just different authentication, yeah. Just different. For example, if you set up a website and say that I want integrated authentication on this website, then you're going to use the 401.
So now you're starting to speak infrastructure.
Yeah.
Integrated auth. So that will pass a user's AD credential through.
Exactly. That's going to pass the either pass the local credentials if the client is set up to trust that source, or it's going to pop up a box saying that, okay, fill out your username and password and then pass the credentials over. And it support, I mean, if you set up an IIS server, you can have basic authentication, which is unencrypted, digest authentication and different types. So the NetScaler handles all the different types that the IIS uses.
So is that the same thing as Kerberos?
Kerberos is the third one, and it's
a little more challenging.
Yeah.
Play down.
It is supported in some features, and in some features is not supported.
So in a desktop virt world, where we're leveraging some of the basic technologies, XenApp and desktop are behind pretty much every NetScaler implementation I've touched. What are some of the examples that you've seen that people where they started off in that world and then they started throwing up like the AAA BIPs?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the most common way to set up today is Exchange. Most people set it up in front of Outlook Web Access, for example. Most of you probably have an Outlook Web Access in your company. Fairly easy way to do. The only thing you need to consider there is where to put the authentication. Do you want the Outlook Web Access, the Exchange server to handle authentication, or do you want to do it on the endpoint out on NetScaler? I would recommend using it on the NetScaler and let that, because otherwise you are going to let unauthenticated users into the backend servers. So
does that screw with Outlook Anywhere at all?
No, it's just a matter of how you want to. Exactly.
The user never sees an authentication dialog.
The user will never see an authentication dialog. What you need to think about though is the button, the public or private laptop, if you're using the external authentication, because the user is never going to see that. So set it up so every user is treated as an external user or a private laptop or public or whatever you want to use. You have to choose.
Gotcha.
You can on the other hand.
SharePoint, Link, pretty much any website. I've got to imagine that you run into some challenges, like trying to do the forum posts and things like that.
I would say any website you actually have in the environment can be used with the AAA server. Either use the 401-based authentication or the form-based with a single sign-on. There is one challenge, and that's systems, for example, some WebSphere. I'm not sure if anyone using IBM WebSphere in here, or one. They work as well, but for example, some of their apps actually use dynamic information during the logon process, which is set when you actually hit the logon page. So you can't do a single sign-on form-based logon to that page because the dynamic value is not going to be created. So those type of cases will create an issue, but in most of the cases you can also disable that feature in the backend. So otherwise it's straight through. So it's not magic. It's easy to do. Just try it. It's a really good way of securing resources, and it also enables you to publish, for example, the internal network like intranet or whatever you want to get on the outside.
So a lot of people, if they're coming from into this as, hey, I got to use this thing for a desktop, or I've got XenApp or XenDesktop or those types of things. Start off learning in terms of policies, authentication policies. You got to have those, and session policies. But I know there's some other ones there that are pretty darn powerful, but a lot of people, it takes them a little bit of time to dig in. Like responder,
exactly.
rewrite policies.
You have, like Rick saying, you have the responder policies, you have the rewrite policies. You also have, for example, the URL transformation policies. I'm not sure if any of you have published an internal resource, and of course it's going to have a lot of internal server names in it. For example, you have a different domain name system on the internal network. The problem in publishing those outside is that as soon as you click a link, you're not going to go anywhere because they're pointing at a resource that's not available on the internet. You can use there's an automatic feature in that's called URL transformation, which basically say that, okay, I want to translate from this internal resource name to the external resource name. It's fairly easy to do. The problem is if you're doing a more advanced website or especially undeveloped and stuff like that, because URL transformation is based on that it knows, for example, what is a link, what is a URL, and stuff like that. If you have a lot of Java, JavaScript, Java apps, ASP code, whatever, the URL transformation is not going to know all of them.
So is that a rewrite policy?
That is basically the built-in combination of different rewrite policies. What I would do instead is actually use a rewrite policy. Set up a rewrite policy that actually looks for the real internal DNS name, and everything that passes through the NetScaler is going to replace with the external available name. And then you do the same thing when you basically go back in, that you have another rewrite policy that converts it back again. You need to think about a couple of things. For example, URLs is both in the body, like in the web code, but it's also going to exist in the header of the traffic that goes out. So you probably going to need at least 2 of those rewrite policies. You can also combine them with the URL rewrite rule, and let the automatic system handle most of it. And if you hit a snag, just use the rewrite policy. Rewrite policy is actually the same thing we use to change the code on the logo in the web interface there. So.
Gotcha. So that kind of boils back. You gotta know something about those expressions to be able to use those, right?
Exactly. When it comes to that, we're talking about layer 7. It's the application layer, so you do need to know some HTML code, some ASP code, Java, whatever it is you're gonna change. So it's not a bad thing if you have a coding background. Actually, it's gonna help you a lot on the way. But otherwise, talk to your developers. Most companies do have internal development, so just talk to them, and they will point out where you need to change stuff.
So remind me to ask you later on about the bugs and the VPX that you found, but we don't need to touch on that right now.
No.
So an example of the URL rewrites.
I can just show one example I have here for set up. So a rewrite policy is the same as, for example, a responder policy. They are based on a policy and on an action or a profile, whatever it is. But mostly they call it actions when they're talking about different policies. The policy explains when to use that specific action, basically. If we take a look, for example. I have a couple of policies here that we used to change the access gateway logo. And in this case, the policy is looking for any URL in the full URL length that includes the word .png, because we're going to switch out one of the images. We're also looking for any host name that contains AG1, because we only want this rule to hit the AG1 site. And in this case, we need to check for the host name because we're using multiple hosts on the same vServer. We can skip that if we apply them only to a specific vServer, but if we're using, for example, content switching, which we're going to talk a little about, where you have multiple servers on the same site, you might want to specify exactly which server it is you want to use on. Here it gets a little bit more complicated. I mean, we're using, for example, ignore case in this one, which is basically we take every expression that passes through it, we ignore if it's uppercase or lowercase. Otherwise, if someone actually hits a lowercase in the URL, it's going to go on the lowercase in the rule. So ignore all the different cases. In this case, we don't need it because there's a built-in feature called .server, which just looks at the server name in the URL, in the host header, and actually is case insensitive. So depends on which rule you're using, you need to be sure to.
So while I'm playing the networking ignorant rockstar engineer, can you kind of step back half a step and show us how these different pieces plug together and how you set up that bit? I know we're going a little unscripted here, but...
We've been doing that all the time. In this case, we're using the web interface, but I can use a regular VIP. And a VIP, how many of you have set up just basic load balancing? We're going back now to basic stuff. Half about. A VIP is basically built out, I mean, if we go from like the smallest component, a VIP is based on, first of all, you need a server, something in the back end that you're going to send everything to. In this case, we have, for example, an LDAP server. We also need something to bind that server together. For example, we're using a service group or a list of services. I tend to use service groups for everything because even if you're just going to have one server, it's not going to take long until they say, oh, by the way, we have another server now. Can you enter that in the load balancing as well? If you use service groups, I mean, you're all set to just add as many services you want to in that.
So I define a server for the resources.
You design a server. The server can be used for any type of service on any protocol. Then you say, for example, okay, I want to set up a web-based system now. So you create a service group that is using the HTTP protocol. In this case, we say that this service group contains one server. It's using the port 80. We also say, for example, what type of monitor we're going to use. How do you know that that server is alive? And how do you know which of the servers are alive? Well, you can do monitors.
I mean, come on, ping works, right?
Exactly. Ping is the best way to check if a server is alive. It doesn't tell you anything about if the server is actually responding or if it's actually working. I would say use a different set of service monitors. For example, in this case, we have a web interface monitor. There is a long list of pre-configured monitors. Don't change the original ones. Create new monitors when you do that. You can, for example, check on the HTTP monitor. Fairly straightforward. For example, how long can a service be down before you say it's actually down? How many times do you retry?
So in terms of our time, let's assume that we've already been through, we know how to set up the basic stuff, the basic AG-VIP, web interface sites, and so forth. The basic stuff that most of us can go out and grab a white paper. Can you kind of show me how you did the rewrite stuff on that AG-VIP?
Exactly.
Is that pretty straightforward?
In this case, since it is an access gateway VIP,
AG-VIP. Got
We go into the Access Gateway VIP, we go to Policies, Rewrite, and here you can see that we have 3 different rewrite engines, rewrite policies for the different sites. So I have the AG1, AG2, and I have the RD websites. And here are the different expressions that we're going to look for. You're not going to be able to see it now. You can see that we look for example, a PNG file. And we can also see that all the policies have a corresponding action to it. That in this case is a replace method, which means that I'm going to take whatever I set up in the expression and replace the content with something else. In this case, we're going to look for, in the URL, we're going to look for exactly the word login icon.png. And I want to replace that with ag1.jpg instead. We can, for example, set up a replace all here and look for multiple instances of something. We can set up an insert, so we can, for example, push in another code piece. We can push in a lot of code as well. We can actually insert a full website into an existing website by just using a feature called HTTP callout. What we'll do here is basically replace that part of the code with that one. And we replace the GET request, so we actually don't replace the code in this case. We replace whatever the user is trying to fetch to his browser.
So then that rewrite policy is watching the traffic coming in, and then when it sees the request coming back out, it's actually rewriting the HTML code.
It's actually rewriting on the request coming in this case. We can choose if we want to replace or rewrite the outgoing code. Then we're using a http.res, which means the result. Or we can use it on the request side. So we actually replace whatever the user sends in, we replace it on NetScaler before we start sending it to the backend server. So you have to keep in mind if it's an outgoing or an incoming request you're replacing.
What would be the ramifications of doing one versus the other?
The only thing that's going to happen is that if you're using a result policy and you're trying to change something incoming, nothing's going to happen. The most common issue with policies that I deal with is people set up a policy and they say it doesn't work. I mean, nothing's get replaced. And it's either because they did the expression wrong or they applied it to the wrong place. So they're looking at the incoming request instead of going for outgoing results.
All right, so what else? Say we're working our way through this stuff. You just gave us some good examples of AAA. We didn't dig in too deep because that's a pretty complex demo to set up.
Yeah, it's a complex demo to set up.
AAA in front, we talked about URL, rewriting.
I would say the biggest gain you're going to get if you start publishing websites is content switching. Better than sliced bread for hosting.
So what's different between content switching and rewriting?
Content switching is actually a way of pushing out different websites or different services. You had your load balance V servers. The content switch is basically built upon that. So you can actually say that I want to hit all these 10 websites, but I only want to use one external IP for that. So you set up a V server, and then you say that, okay, depending on the incoming information, for example, if you're hitting this URL, I'm going to send you to this group in the backend. If you use this URL, I'm going to send you to another group in the backend. If you're, for example, hosting an Exchange system or an Outlook Web Access or whatever, everything can go through 443. Then you can set up a content switch. Look for example, if you're trying to do the auto discovery or if you're trying to hit the Outlook Web Access, just push it back to different backend servers, and you're still just going to use one external IP for everything.
And is that based on the URL that the user's coming in on, or?
That can be based on everything. You can, for example, look on the URL. That's the most common thing. You can also say that, okay, if you're using a mobile browser, I'm going to send you to another backend server. Citrix have the classic red, blue, green server when they differentiate. For example, if you hit the URL 1, you're going to get the red background. So you can send to different backend servers, different web servers, depending on what what is you requesting. For example, if you want to get a JPEG image or basically any image on a website, you can say that, okay, I want images to be collected from this web server because they have, for example, a faster connection to the data store where you keep the files. Or I can say that these servers are better to handle dynamic code. Really common thing that we see a lot today is that the larger sites, I mean, they basically have their full own infrastructure for just the first page you hit. So if you go, for example, to Amazon or whatever, I can't say exactly for Amazon, but most of the bigger web stores, the first site you land on, that gotta load instantly. Whatever happens on the rest of the pages doesn't care. So the first site, that's an entire different website. It's an entire different backend service just there to answer quickly.
But you could use other techniques too, like caching, compression.
You can use a lot of different techniques like caching and compression. You basically offloading anything from the backend server and letting NetScaler handle it instead. I would say using content switching and learning how to use that is something that's going to help you a lot.
So is that one of the places, besides obviously learning something about expressions?
Yeah.
Is that one of the first areas of the NetScaler you'd...
Expressions, and then start pushing out services, and especially use content switching even if you're just going to use a single server that's going to publish. I mean, if you're using Wildcard, it's really easy because you can, for example, host all your web servers in one external IP address. You can group them, for example, if you have some servers that you want to use smart card authentication on, then you of course need to set it up on a different content switch because you need to enable client-side authentication or client certificate authentication. So that is going to need a separate content switch, but otherwise push everything to one content switch as much as you can because the expressions will help you send it to different backends.
So while I'm playing the glossy-eyed non-network guy, when you're talking about content switches, are those like you've got policies and you've got VIPs for those?
Exactly. The VIP is still, I mean, you still have one VIP for everything, the virtual IP, but you have one content switch using one VIP, but it's also using, for example, 10 different V servers in the background. So it's sending the traffic back to the different V servers. So still one VIP, lots of V servers, and for all of you who think VIP and V server is the same thing, it's not. VIP is the IP address and V server is one object that is using a IP address. So content switching is based on expressions. You can apply all the reroute policies, you can apply all the responders on a content switch, but you can also apply, for example, different expressions. I can show one case here where we do have a content switch set up. This content switch doesn't do anything except everything that comes to this IP. So nothing is going to be sent to anywhere, but everything that comes here will be redirected to HTTPS through a responder policy. So you can set up, for example, if you have the outer web access, if you have external network, internet or whatever, everything that hits HTTP will be automatically redirected to HTTPS, and it doesn't matter which URL you hit because in this case, for example, we just take the existing hostname you entered, we take the existing path and query, which means everything you wrote after a server name, and we just apply HTTPS port and say that, okay, go to this site now.
So this seems a little bit more sophisticated than setting up an HTTP load balanced VIP and not binding resources to it and just setting up a redirect.
It's not that complex, actually. I mean, everything in a content switch is based on policies as well. So in this case, for example, we say that everything that has a host name containing DVVA is going to go to one specific load balance server. We can set up, so for example, everything that is containing GIF in the URL is going to go to another load balance server. So we can differentiate on a lot of things. We can say that, for example, if you're trying to access URL 1 and you're using the browser type Mozilla, then you're going to use this load balancer. You can, depending on which web browser you have, depending on what IP you're coming from, I was going to say shoe size, but not always.
So will this help me if because SSL certs, you got to have the DNS name and stuff tied. Can I have a single external IP then bound with multiple different certs?
In the same way here, you can set it up with different certs, either to SNI, but you can support the XPs. I would say use a wildcard cert and set up one content switch for each wildcard cert, because you still can't use different, for example, site1 and site2.com, but you can use subdomains if you use the wildcard. So it's still one.
Have separate fibs for separate root domain names.
Yeah, so one wildcard cert per IP address. You can basically just say that.
Which is easy for me because I own my own Class A.
Exactly.
Yeah,
one thing that we didn't mention is actually a big benefit you can have with the rewrite engine and responders as well. And especially when you set up multiple sites through a content switch, and that's, for example, a 404 issue. When you hit a page that doesn't exist, if you're hosting 30, 40, 50 different websites, most likely if it's in internal resources, they are branded in some way. A lot of companies nowadays actually want a modified 404 page, so it's not the standard built-in IIS page. It's something that has the correct graphical profile. It may contain information, sort of, if you hit this page, please contact this number or whatever. Using the rewrite policies, we can actually look for all the 404s that's being sent from basically any web server in the backend. And instead of sending the regular 404 page or 401 page, we replace them with one single page that has the correct modifications on it. So the users, the backend admins for the IS servers don't have to change anything on their sites. We handle everything on the NetScaler. I can actually show you.
So we're talking content switching stuff.
We can use this in content switching, but we can also set it globally. So anything that's talking HTTP and gets a 404 or 401 or whatever code you want, we're going to replace. I can actually show you a quick example of it. What we do is basically set up a rewrite action, which means that if, we replace the HTTP result. Basically anything that's coming from the backend servers out to the user, doesn't matter what it is, we're going to replace that with the code 302 temporary redirect, which means that when you get this, go to this website instead. Since there are 302, it's temporary redirect, so they won't save it in the browser or in cache. And then go to our unified site, that's site.com/404 or 401 or whatever it is. If it's a page not found or access denied or whatever you want to set up.
So that'd be an external
that will be an external site. This can also be combined with the responder rule, saying that if someone tries to access that URL, the NetScaler is going to do a responder policy. So it actually isn't a site in the background. It's a pure responder policy that says respond with this code. You can either enter the code there, but in the new NetScaler 10, you can actually use a responder policy with a full page. So you can upload a pre-configured website, a HTML file, to the NetScaler, and when someone hit that responder policy, you're going to push out the HTML code or the HTML page instead. So you can actually host that page on the NetScaler.
Any downsides to doing that, aside from the management of the config and making sure that it's
no downsides. The only downside is that if they want to change that, the code on that page, they have to upload it to the NetScaler. And here you can see that the rewrite policy, basically when it's going to hit, basically says that whenever the HTTP result status is 404 in this case, we hit the rule that says replace everything that is being sent to the client with our code instead. So what you did basically is that you solved the modifications of 200 pages or how many you might have, and also you're basically certain that you didn't miss one server. Yes? Good question. The best way of doing that is basically setting up a syslog server somewhere. If that is your Microsoft SCCM or whatever it is, if you're using Kiwi, Splunk, choose whatever method you want to. In the NetScaler, you can set up something called user-defined messages. So for a specific rule or a specific policy, I can set up a syslog rule that says that whenever this hits, I want to send a specific message to the syslog, to the log server, and I want that log error to contain this information. And then you can actually use the built-in policy engine and expressions and say that in the logon message include the URL that the user typed. So the URL that caused the first action to hit, it's going to be entered there, and you can, for example, say that user tried to access this site but failed, and then set up a rule on the backend saying that as soon as one of those rules hit, or as soon as one of those log messages come to the syslog server, send out an email alert or whatever. So you can set up, though, every time someone hits that spot, they're going to be notified about it. It's also the same if you're using, for example, a rewrite rule to fix. This is actually a real case. It was a customer that had a code error in the ASP code. So they have a buffer underrun this situation in the code. We entered a rewrite policy that replaced the code to the correct size of the buffer, memory buffer. We also entered that in a syslog. So anytime a user hit a page with the incorrect code, there was a message sent to the syslog server, and the developers could just sit back and wait for all the messages to hit the log and then know exactly where that code error was.
Wait a minute, so you used NetScaler to fix a lamely coded web app?
Yeah.
That's kind of cool.
Of course, I was going to say, but I'm also going to say that don't tell your web developer that that's the permanent solution. Say that you're buying them time. Because otherwise, I mean, it's the second thing that your web developers are going to hit you hard with different stuff they want to change, because you are saving them a lot of time. Also with minor changes, if they have, for example, an internal site, they're going to ask you to replace all the code that you can, and basically save them time in the long run as well. But it's a lot of rules to manage after a while.
But isn't there some ways, like we were talking the other day about the Nitro APIs, and there's some ways that you could leverage that to let them do some basic administration changes?
Exactly.
Sites?
There is something called the Nitro API. It's just a pure API that's already built in the NetScaler. You can access this through, for example, Java apps. You can access it from PowerShell, ASP code, or whatever. So if you have
service call.
Exactly. So as long as you set up your delegated administration correctly, which I definitely recommend that you have. So don't use NSRoot for everything. I'm not going to ask how many of you actually use NSRoot account for everything. I'm guessing a lot of you. Don't use NSRoot. Set up an external authentication, for example, the LDAP, so that when you log on to the system, use the LDAP source, use Radius or whatever you want. I mean, you can use multiple systems as well, so you can actually most network people like to use Radius or TinyCax. The sysadmin people tend to use LDAP, so whatever is your favorite.
So, an example, I've kind of drawn you off, and I know we got a couple of really cool things we want to talk about. What's a simple example of how you might use those APIs?
For example, let's say you have a customer who, if you're a hosted environment, the customer owns sort of his own environment, but it's hosted at your site. You have a load balanced website with 10, 20, 30 backend web servers. You want the customer to be able to take those servers offline to do stuff, maintenance on them, to change code or whatever they want to do. For example, how can you let the customer take them out of the load balance resource without giving them full access to the website or to the admin GUI? One way is by using actually the monitors, by setting up a monitor, because the monitors, you can add multiple monitors on the same service group. So set up a monitor that actually looks for a page, for example, online.html. If that page doesn't exist, the server is not active. So whenever the customer needs to do something, they just rename the file online.html HTML to something else, and that server is not active in the cluster anymore. The other way is actually using, for example, the API, and you can write your own Java app that actually fetches the information from the NetScaler and just gives them, the only button they have is basically enable, disable server, and just pre-configure the Java app and make sure you have a good naming convention in the NetScaler, so it looks for example, a customer name, for a prefix or whatever, and just fetches that one.
So you can disable a server object?
You can disable a server object, you can disable a full load balanced vServer, whatever you let them do. The benefit of the administration in NetScaler is it's regex based, so you can say that this user can only do stuff on any object that contains this prefix. So anything that contains the customer's name, they can modify. And then just use the API. The API takes some coding skills, but just if you have a Java developer or a PowerShell guru, whatever, they're going to figure it out quite fast. It's documented as well, so.
Gotcha.
But that's a really good way of letting the customers actually do some maintenance themselves.
I like it. So we're down to about 10 minutes. There are a couple of topics that I was kind of excited to talk about that we could spool on for another 2 hours on. One of those was the stuff with SQL. That's kind of new, right? The ability to actually deal with SQL traffic going through NetScaler?
Exactly. SQL is called, they call it the feature data stream. If you see data stream, it's not a protocol, it's just a concept. Citrix is calling it. It's a feature name, yeah. Marketing. It's a really cool feature though. The thing is that if you're using a Microsoft SQL or MySQL, Oracle is coming as well soon, you can actually modify and set up the same rules and policies you have for websites. You can actually set up for databases as well. So the content switch I told you about, you can actually do that for a database and say that point all your web apps or whatever you're using, client server apps, to one IP address or one host name, or different host names but the same VIP, the same vServer, and then let the NetScaler direct the traffic to the most suitable SQL server. For example, let's say you have a cluster. Cluster licenses are quite expensive. You might not need that. You want performance. Let's use a mirror set instead, and then say that for every operation that comes in, we want to split out all the write operations and the read operations. We're going to send the read operations to the slave servers. If you set up, for example, 4 slave servers, we're going to load balance all of those slave servers for the read operations, and then send all the write operations to one specific server.
Wait, so NetScaler can determine based on the TCP traffic flow?
Based on the application layer flow, the NetScaler can, because the NetScaler understands the SQL language, to say it clearly, it looks at the different commands and see, for example, if you're using a select query, you can say that, okay, everything that contains select queries or list or whatever, I'm going to send to this server group, which is only the slave servers. Anything that contains, for example, update, drop, whatever you want to use, send that to the master server. And the NetScaler can actually keep track of which is the master server as well.
So can I apply like authentication-ish policies too? So
not authentication policies, I'm afraid, but and at the moment you can't use Windows integrated authentication on the SQL server. The username on the NetScaler on the SQL server needs to be entered into the NetScaler as well, and you have to use SQL so far, but integrated authentication is this way as well.
So it sounds like a relatively easy way to get started could be the HA-ish with mirroring and...
Exactly. I mean, if you want just performance and load balancing on the different databases, definitely set up a mirror set and then divert reads and write. The things you need to keep track of if you're using stored procedures, since I would say that send all the information that you don't know, for example, the reads like select queries, send everything to the master database just to be sure, because a lot of stored procedures actually result in a write operation. Then, I mean, if you start working with, for example, the web developers or the DBAs, I mean, then you can say, okay, make sure that you sort of tag the different stored procedures, so you know that if a stored procedure is just going to end up in a read operation, send that to, name that so you can actually divert them in the NetScaler as well. There's also one thing I want to mention before, it's security-wise. If you're setting up the NetScaler, make sure that you do some basic security configuration. For example, any certificate you publish, make sure that you're using the correct cipher suit so you don't have the default, which is unfortunately default. You want to go into the NetScaler and change that to, for example, high, so you're not using weak ciphers on your web servers, or even on the access gateway you have to do that. If you do a penetration testing or if you do an audit for compliance, you are going to get shut. They're going to put a big red blob in there. You want to disable features like SSL renegotiation, say that once you've decided on a cipher suit, you're not going to be able to renegotiate that because there are some known exploits on that.
So for someone that's not like a complete PKI freak, that sounds pretty daunting. Is that something you can show us pretty quick, like some basic best practice around?
It's fairly easy actually to do. We still have our access gateway site. The thing is just getting a quite good basic level is quite easy. You have the certificates you're using. You want to just go into the ciphers.
So we do this on a bit by bit basis, or can we?
You have to do this on a vServer by vServer basis.
Sorry, I keep jacking with your terms.
In this case, I've already done it, but there are pre-configured groups. Normally, the default group is selected here. Just go in there, remove the default group. There is, for example, a high group. If you have really thorough penetration tester, they are going to hit you in the high group as well because it contains a cipher that isn't actually approved as a high cipher. But I would say it's about 50-50 if your pen tester will hit you on that one.
Is there any reason, recognizing they're going to pull the plug and
they could actually pull the plug because they could actually pull the plug.
The session, but
oh yeah, we got.
Yeah, we're getting that yank.
Yeah, that's a single thing. You can also go in and disable, for example, if you want to disable SLV2 redirect. It's not going to use SLV2, but the pen tester will say no to that because it's actually saying that you can redirect to SLV2, but it's not going to do it.
So that sounds like something that actually sounds like a great white paper, a blog article.
There are a couple of white papers out there. I would say that I would do the last thing, but I can't actually access it in the GUI here.
They're shutting us down anyway.
Just so you know, go in, do your basic sort of configuration on security. You will be getting jacked otherwise on the pen test.
Right on. Okay, so wrapping it up. Hopefully you like this format, a little bit different format. Wish we had a few more demos to be able to show. Maybe it's a conversation outside afterwards about some of the bugs that you found here. But hopefully you have recognized here, NetScalers are all over the place. I haven't touched, but one system in 6 years, I think, that hasn't had a NetScaler in place. So they're everywhere, they're expensive, so in a lot of cases, organizations are looking for ways to kind of justify what it is that they're doing with it. And especially for a non-networking kind of guy, these things can be kind of daunting to get into. But one thing I would definitely suggest, coming from a non-networking guy kind of a background, right? I was playing a little bit stupid, I have to admit here today, just to try and draw out some of the details. But even coming from a non-network focused background, was not that complicated to get in and start doing some pretty cool and advanced stuff on that. So I'd say definitely take advantage of that stuff. Spend a little bit of time, and hopefully you two can also milk a little bit more value out of this stuff.